The rain had been falling for 3 days straight. Not the violent cleansing kind of rain that washes sins away and leaves the world feeling scrubbed and new. This was Portland rain. Cold, persistent, the kind that seeps into the spaces between your bones and makes you forget what warmth ever felt like. It turned the textile district into a maze of gray brick and deeper shadows, where steam rising from street grates mixed with exhaust fumes to create a fog that made everything look like something half-remembered from a dream you couldn't quite hold on to after waking. Caleb Morrow had learned to love the rain. It kept people indoors. It made him invisible. He sat in the recessed doorway of an abandoned loading dock on 4th Avenue, his back pressed against rusted metal that had once been painted red but was now the color of dried blood. The overhang above him was deep enough to keep most of the water off, and the ventilation duct from the bakery next door pushed out warm air that smelled like yeast and brown sugar and cinnamon. It was the closest thing to home he had known in 8 months. His clothes hung off him like they belonged to a larger, more substantial person. An army jacket 3 sizes too big, olive drab, gone gray with grime, a tear in the left shoulder that let the cold breathe in against his skin. Jeans held up with a length of paracord because the belt loops had rotted through. Sneakers with soles worn so thin he could feel the individual stones in the pavement through them, could feel the cold of the wet concrete radiating up through his feet and into his legs, like something trying to pull him down into the earth. His blonde hair, matted and darkened with grease, was tucked under a black wool beanie he had found in a dumpster behind a thrift store on Burnside. He had boiled it in a coffee can over a fire before he wore it. That was the kind of thinking that kept you alive out here. The small, unglamorous details of survival that nobody ever talked about because nobody wanted to imagine they might one day need to know them. He was 17 years old. At 17, Caleb Morrow had mastered the art of being nothing. The rules were simple, and they had taken him months to learn through painful trial and error. If you don't meet people's eyes, they don't register you as a person. You become part of the landscape, a heap of fabric and shadow, something the eye slides over the way it slides over a fire hydrant or a pile of cardboard. If you don't move, you're just architecture. If you don't speak, you don't exist. You become the negative space between real things. The gap, the absence. He wasn't an addict. That was the first thing people assumed, and the assumption made him useful because it made him forgettable in the right way. He wasn't mentally ill, though 8 months of sleeping rough and eating out of dumpsters had done things to his thinking that he didn't like to examine too closely. He was just a kid who had concluded, after careful consideration of the available evidence, that sleeping under a bridge in the rain was safer than sleeping in the house of a man named Warren Pruitt. 8 months ago, on a Tuesday night in October, Caleb had climbed out of a second-story window in a house on the east side of Portland. He had dropped 12 feet into a juniper hedge that tore long red lines across his forearms. He had lain in the wet mulch under the hedge for almost a full minute, listening to the sounds of the house above him before he had gotten up, crossed the yard without looking back, slipped through the gap in the wooden fence, and walked away into a night that felt, despite everything, like the first breath of air after being held underwater. The state had issued a warrant for him within 72 hours. Juvenile delinquency, the paperwork said. Warren Pruitt had reported him for stealing $200 from a coffee can in the kitchen. Caleb had never touched that money. He had never touched anything in that kitchen that wasn't explicitly offered to him. But he had learned across 6 foster placements in 5 years that the truth was a luxury available to people who had adults willing to speak it on their behalf. Foster kids didn't have that. Foster kids had paperwork and social workers with 80 case loads and judges who believed the adults in the room because the adults in the room knew how to dress and how to speak and how to arrange their faces into expressions of appropriate concern. So Caleb had disappeared. He had survived on scraps and the occasional kindness of soup kitchens that didn't ask for ID. He had worked day labor when he could find it cash under the table, carrying things and cleaning things and digging things, the invisible work that invisible people do. He had learned the topology of Portland's shelter system and then learned to avoid most of it because shelters had intake procedures, and intake procedures left paper trails, and paper trails led back to Warren Pruitt. His only possession of real value leaned against the brick wall beside him. 3 feet of solid hickory salvaged from an industrial broom handle he had found in a construction dumpster on Glisson Street. The wood was dense and close-grained, the kind that didn't crack under impact, the kind that held its integrity even when wet. He had sanded it smooth over several evenings using a strip of concrete block he had found in an alley, then wrapped one end in black electrical tape for grip. He had balanced it, tested its swing weight, worked with it until it felt like an extension of his arm rather than something he was holding. It wasn't a walking stick. It wasn't decoration. It was a tool for stray dogs, for the drunks who liked to kick homeless kids for entertainment on Friday nights, for the moments when invisibility failed and something else was required. Caleb checked his watch, a cheap digital thing he had found in a pawn shop trash bin. The numbers faded at the edges, but still legible if he tilted it toward the light. 3:58 in the afternoon. Almost time. Every Tuesday she came. He didn't know her name, didn't know anything about her beyond the observable facts that his months on the street had trained him to catalog automatically. She drove a black Jeep Wrangler, kept clean to the point of obsession, not a scratch on it. She arrived at almost exactly 4 o'clock and parked in the same spot in this alley 30 feet from where the loading dock doorway sat in shadow. She carried herself differently from the other young women he saw moving through this part of the city. There was no ease in her posture, none of the unguarded softness that came from moving through a world you believed was fundamentally safe. She walked with her head up and her eyes moving. She checked corners. She noted people. She wore leather jackets that looked expensive and boots that looked functional, and she kept her right hand closer to her bag than most people kept their hands to anything. She was probably 20 years old. She was in the gray arithmetic of Caleb's world, the most beautiful thing he had regular access to. He told himself he watched her because the alley was his territory, because knowing the rhythms of a place was what kept you safe in it. He told himself it was purely observational, the way you track the garbage truck schedule or memorize which restaurants put their food waste out early. The truth was simpler and more embarrassing. He watched her because for 60 seconds every Tuesday afternoon, he could almost feel like a normal 17-year-old boy watching a girl walk by. Because for 60 seconds, the world contracted to something human-sized and warm. Then she would disappear through the gate at the far end of the alley toward the university campus, and the world would expand back to its actual dimensions, and he would go back to being invisible. He heard the engine before he saw the headlights. The black Jeep turned into the alley at 3:59, moving at the careful speed of someone who knew the space well. The headlights cut through the mist, illuminating the wet brick walls on either side and turning the puddles on the asphalt into mirrors. The Jeep rolled to its usual stop, engine cutting lights dying. The girl stepped out. She was wearing a gray hoodie under a denim jacket, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that the rain had begun to soften at the edges. She locked the Jeep behind her with a soft electronic chirp, then pulled her phone from her jacket pocket and dropped her eyes to the screen. Her thumb moved across the glass, scrolling the posture of someone momentarily gone from the world. That was when Caleb heard the tires. The sound came from the mouth of the alley to his left, a high, shrieking protest of rubber against wet pavement, the sound of a vehicle moving too fast and angling too deliberately. A white Ford Transit van came around the corner and didn't slow down. It crossed the alley entrance at speed and then cut hard, the tires screaming again as it corrected, blocking the mouth of the alley completely, the Jeep now boxed in with nowhere to go. Caleb was on his feet before he had consciously decided to stand. His hand found the hickory stick against the wall beside him, the way a hand finds a railing in the dark by memory and necessity. The van's side door slid open before the vehicle had fully stopped moving. 3 men came out in the fluid, unhurried way of people who have done a thing enough times that it no longer requires thought. They were large in the way of men who have spent serious time and money building themselves into weapons. Gym muscle, the kind that came from controlled environments and supplements, rather than from the unpredictable resistance of actual physical work. The first man had a tattoo on his neck, something dark and angular that crawled up from his collar. He moved to the right, putting himself between the girl and the alley gate. The second wore a bomber jacket that was wrong for the rain, his face flat and without expression, the face of someone who had learned to keep whatever was happening inside him from reaching the surface. He moved left, cutting off the return path to the Jeep. The third was leaner than the other two, quicker in his movements, with the efficient economy of someone for whom violence was a professional skill rather than an emotional release. He came straight down the middle. Caleb registered all of this in the half-second before his attention snagged on the detail that changed everything. None of them were wearing masks. The observation moved through him like cold water, immediate and clarifying. He understood what it meant the way you understood certain things on the street, not through reasoning, but through the accumulated weight of experience. Men who wore masks intended to leave witnesses. Men who didn't wear masks had made a different calculation entirely. No masks meant no survivors. No masks meant the girl with the phone and the clean Jeep in the 60 seconds of Tuesday warmth she had given him without knowing it was not expected to be able to describe them afterward. The girl saw them. She didn't scream. That registered too, the absence of the scream, the way her body recalibrated instead of collapsing into panic. Her phone dropped from her fingers and she was already moving her hand to her bag, going for something the motion trained and deliberate. She didn't get there. The man with the neck tattoo? Strand barked two words. The other two moved simultaneously, the bomber jacket man, coming in from the left side, low and fast, driving into her like a linebacker, catching her at the hip, and carrying her momentum sideways into the body of the Jeep. The sound of her head connecting with the door panel was a flat, wet crack that bounced off the brick walls of the alley and hit Caleb somewhere behind his sternum. The lean one, Travis, grabbed her legs as she kicked weakly, the concussion doing its work, already making the messages between her brain and her muscles run slow and garbled. Strand grabbed a fistful of her ponytail and used it to pull her head back, exposing her throat, controlling her. His other hand produced a length of zip tie from his jacket pocket. Professional. Prepared. Caleb's hands were shaking. Every instinct he had spent 8 months sharpening was screaming at him with one voice. The voice was rational, and it was survival tested, and everything it was telling him was true. You are 17 years old. You weigh 130 pounds. You haven't eaten a full meal in 4 days. You have a stick. They have guns almost certainly because men like this always have guns. This is not your business. This is not your fight. You stay in the shadow and you stay invisible and you live, and that is the only arithmetic that matters. He heard her voice. It came out raw and desperate, the voice of someone who was strong and knew it, and was terrified anyway because knowing you were strong didn't help when there were 3 of them and 1 of you. It came from somewhere under Strand's hand, muffled and fighting. She said, "Get off me." She said it twice. And then a hand came down over her mouth and the sound was gone, and the alley was just rain and the idle of the van engine and the sound of zip ties being cinched. Something cracked open inside Caleb Morrow. Not metaphorically. He felt it physically, a fracture in the wall he had been building and maintaining since the night in the juniper hedge brick. By careful brick, the wall that let him walk past, suffering without stopping, because stopping was dying. He felt it go, and then what came through the gap was not courage exactly, because courage implies a choice freely made from a position of safety. What came through was older than that, something that had been sitting at the bottom of him through 6 foster placements and 8 months in the rain, and every night he had lain still and quiet, in places he shouldn't have had to lie still and quiet in. He was so tired of looking away. Caleb stepped out of the doorway. His legs felt wrong under him, hollow and disconnected, but they moved. One step, then another, his sneakers quiet on the wet asphalt. His right hand tightened around the tape-wrapped end of the hickory stick. The grip was good. He had practiced the grip. The grip was the one thing he trusted right now. 20 yards. The 3 men were focused entirely on the girl, on the logistics of getting her into the van quickly and cleanly. They were professionals, and professionals sometimes made the mistake of believing that the threat assessment they performed at the start of an operation was complete. They had looked at this alley. They had not seen him. He was as he had worked so hard to become invisible. 15 yards. Travis was bent forward, still wrestling with her legs, his back to Caleb, his weight committed to the task in front of him. 10 yards. Caleb stopped thinking. Thinking was the enemy right now. Thinking would remind him of all the specific and accurate reasons why what he was doing would kill him. 5 yards. He raised the hickory stick over his right shoulder the way he had watched baseball players on the televisions in the windows of electronics stores, driving all of his weight into a rotation that started at his feet and moved up through his hips and back and shoulders and arms. The wood connected with the back of Travis's knee at full swing. The sound was a dry, dense crack like a green branch being forced past its limit. Travis's leg buckled sideways the way a leg should not buckle, bending in a direction knees were not built to accommodate. He went down hard, face first, into a puddle, his hands not getting under him in time, the shock of it overriding his ability to make his arms cooperate. Strand spun. Caleb used the momentum of the first swing the way a physics problem used momentum, not wasting it by trying to reset. Instead, driving the opposite end of the stick forward, like a spear, two-handed his body behind it. The end connected with Strand's solar plexus, driving deep. The air came out of the man in a wet, collapsing rush. His hands went to his middle and he folded over them, wheezing the zip ties falling from his fingers. The girl was on the wet asphalt, partially dazed, blood tracking from her hairline where her head had met the Jeep. She was looking up at Caleb with an expression that was trying to do too many things at once, trying to process pain and fear and the completely inexplicable sight of a filthy, wild-eyed boy in an oversized army jacket holding a stick like it was Excalibur. Caleb's voice came out strange to his own ears, raspy and underused, a hinge that hadn't been turned in too long. He looked at her and said one word: run. The man in the bomber jacket, Rook, had not moved yet. He had not moved because he was the professional among professionals, the one who assessed before he committed. And what he was assessing was whether this was a real threat or something he could handle at the end of the transaction. He reached his conclusion quickly. He reached into his jacket and produced a folding knife, the blade catching the flat gray light as it locked open. 6 inches of steel. He was smiling. The smile was not warm. It was the expression of someone who genuinely enjoyed the moment when a problem resolved itself into something simple and physical. He held the knife with the relaxed grip of someone who knew exactly what to do with it, the blade angled slightly upward. He said, "I'm going to gut you, little rat." His voice was calm, almost conversational. Caleb backed up, putting the stick between himself and the knife, trying to remember everything he had ever seen or heard about knife fighting, which was nothing useful, which was the whispered stories from other kids in group homes and the vague general knowledge that knives were faster than sticks, and that the person holding the knife almost always won. His hands were shaking. His breath was coming in short, panicked pulls that weren't giving him enough air. He could feel his body trying to inventory what was wrong with the situation and running out of space before it finished. Rook lunged. The move was fast and committed, the lunge of someone who had done this before and was not worried about the outcome. Caleb swung the stick in a wild arc, a desperate rather than strategic movement, and felt it connect with the man's forearm. But Rook was riding on adrenaline and contempt, and neither of them slowed him. His free hand shot out and caught the hickory stick fingers locking around it, and he yanked. Caleb's feet left the wet pavement. He came forward off balance, pulled by his own grip on the stick, and the knife was coming up, and there was nothing between him and it except about 18 inches of cold air, and the decision his body made in the next fraction of a second without consulting him. He had spent years in foster homes dodging things, fists mostly, thrown objects, the physics of being a smaller person in a space controlled by a larger, angrier one. His body had built reflexes he hadn't consciously designed, automatic recalculations of trajectory and distance that happened below the level of thought. He twisted in midair. The blade came through his jacket at the left side above the hip, slicing through the layered fabric and finding skin. The pain was immediate and specific, a hot line drawn across his ribs, the kind of pain that didn't spread but concentrated, that made itself known with absolute clarity. But Rook had made a mistake. He was still holding the stick. Caleb let go. The release of tension was sudden and total, and Rook stumbled backward with the stick still in his fist. His balance suddenly wrong, his weight committed to a resistance that was no longer there. Caleb didn't retreat. He scrambled up onto the hood of the Jeep, his sneakers slipping twice on the wet metal, hauling himself up by the windshield, and then he launched himself. His right heel caught Rook across the bridge of the nose. The sound was wet and definitive. Blood sprayed across the wet asphalt in a dark fan. Rook went backward, roaring, both hands going to his face, the knife and the stick both clattering to the pavement. Behind him, Strand had recovered enough to straighten. His right hand went to the back of his waistband and came back with a gun, a compact black pistol that seemed to absorb the gray afternoon light rather than reflect it. His face was still creased with pain from the strike to his abdomen, but his hand was steady. He was raising the weapon. Caleb was on the hood of the Jeep. He could see everything with the terrible crystalline clarity that came when his body had decided that this was the moment where it either survived or didn't. He could see the raindrops suspended for one impossible instant in the air around him. He could see the blood running from the girl's hairline diluted pink by the rain as it reached her cheek. He could see the particular way Strand's finger was moving toward the trigger. He was going to die in this alley. He understood that with complete, unemotional certainty. 17 years old, nameless, unremembered, just another body the city would process and move on from. He thought about the warrant with his name on it. He thought about Warren Pruitt filing the paperwork with that expression he wore, the one that looked like concern and meant something entirely different. Then the girl moved. She had pushed herself to one knee. One hand was pressed against the wound on her forehead. The other hand was inside her jacket, moving with the deliberate, focused motion of someone who was badly hurt, and working through it, not panicking, just working. Her hand came out holding a taser, black and yellow blocky, the kind that fired probes on wires. She did not hesitate. She did not warn. She did not give Strand the opportunity to recalculate. She fired. The two probes crossed the space between them and hit Strand in the neck and upper shoulder. 50,000 volts moved through the wire and into the man's body, and his muscles locked simultaneously, every voluntary system in him overridden in an instant. His back arched. His feet left the ground briefly. The gun fell from fingers that were no longer receiving instructions, clattering against the wet asphalt. And then Strand followed it, going down like a structure whose foundation had been removed, the impact heavy and complete. His body twitched in the puddle. Rook looked at Strand, looked at the gun lying in the rain, looked at Caleb still on the hood of the Jeep, bleeding through his jacket, chest heaving. Then he looked at Travis, who was still on the ground near the back of the van, making sounds that were trying to be words, but not quite getting there, both hands pressed to his destroyed knee. Rook made a calculation. It took less time than drawing a breath. He said, "Let's go." He grabbed Strand under the arms and dragged him toward the van. Travis pulled himself along the pavement on his hands, pulling his useless leg behind him, leaving a dark smear on the wet asphalt. The van's engine roared and the door slid shut, and the tires laid black marks on the asphalt as the vehicle accelerated through the far end of the alley, clipping a dumpster with a scream of metal on metal, and then was gone into the rain-gray streets of Portland. Silence came down like something physical. Caleb stood on the hood of the Jeep and listened to his own breathing and the sound of rain on metal, and he could not for several seconds make himself move. His whole body was shaking with the particular violence of adrenaline that had nowhere to go, the aftermath of something the nervous system was not designed to process and then simply continue. His face was wet. He wasn't certain all of it was rain. He looked down at his left side. The jacket was torn open in a 6-inch gash above his hip, the fabric dark and wet in a way that rain alone didn't account for. He pressed his hand against it and felt the heat in the sharp protest of the wound beneath. Not deep. He was almost certain it wasn't deep. But long, and the blood was coming steadily, and his side was already beginning to stiffen around the injury, the way the body did when it was trying to wall something off. He heard her voice. "Are you okay?" He had almost forgotten about her. She had gotten to her feet. She was leaning against the body of the Jeep with one hand, the other still pressed to her forehead, the taser hanging loose at her side. Her legs were shaking visibly, fine tremors running through them, but her eyes were focused and clear, and they were on him with an intensity that was hard to look at directly. Caleb slid off the hood. His sneakers hit the puddles and he stumbled, catching himself against the Jeep's front panel, then straightening. He put distance between them automatically 5 feet, the distance of someone who had learned that proximity to other people rarely ended well. He was aware with sudden acute consciousness of how he must look, how he must smell. 8 months of industrial bathroom sinks and camp soap of clothes that had never fully dried of sleeping in whatever he could find. He was aware of the matted hair under the beanie and the grime worked into the creases of his knuckles and the way his jacket hung off him like something borrowed from a much larger life. He said, "I'm fine." His voice came out like a rusted hinge. She said, "You're bleeding." He said, "So are you." Somewhere in the distance, rising through the wet air from multiple directions, the sound of sirens, getting louder. Someone in the apartments above the alley had already made the call. Caleb's stomach dropped. Police meant questions. Questions meant names. Names meant databases. Databases meant the warrant, and the warrant meant Warren Pruitt's address. And Warren Pruitt's address meant going back to the house on the east side with the basement he was not going to think about right now. He said, "I have to go." She took a step toward him. She said, "Wait, what's your name?" He picked up the hickory stick from where it had fallen near the rear tire of the Jeep. Rook had left it when he ran. The end was splintered where it had connected with Travis's knee, but the wood was still solid, still his. He said, "It doesn't matter." "Please," she said, "you saved my life." He looked at the gun lying in the puddle. Strand's gun. If the police found it, they would start asking questions that started with who fired this and ended with places he could not afford to go. He said, "Hide the gun. Tell them you fought them off yourself. Don't tell them I was here. They'll put me back in the homes." She stared at him. Her eyes were doing something complicated, trying to understand what she was looking at, this boy with the stick and the bloody jacket and the absolute certainty in his voice when he talked about the homes. But Caleb was already moving. He turned toward the far end of the alley, toward the place where the shadows between buildings deepened into something he could disappear into, toward the maze of the textile district, where the city's forgotten spaces held people like him, the way cupped hands held water. "Thank you," she called after him. Her voice broke in the middle of the words. Caleb didn't look back. He ran. He couldn't know that behind him the girl was reaching for her phone with shaking hands. Didn't know that the name she was about to say into that phone would set in motion a machinery of loyalty and violence, and something older than either that the city of Portland had not seen deployed in years. Didn't know that within the hour a man named Declan Callahan would be watching grainy security footage of a skinny boy with a stick and a willingness to die for a stranger, and that something in that footage would reach through 20 years of armor and touch whatever had always been at the center of him. Caleb Morrow ran through the rain of Portland's textile district and became invisible again, as he had trained himself to be, as he had learned to be out of necessity and grief and the slow grinding weight of years in which invisibility was the only form of safety available to him. He did not know that the part of his life that required invisibility was without his knowledge and against all probability ending. He just ran. By the time he reached the shelter of the 4th Street overpass, the sirens had multiplied and the rain had intensified, and his side was hurting badly enough that each step required a conscious negotiation between his will and his body. He found a dry spot under the concrete and lowered himself to the ground and unzipped his jacket and looked at the wound. It was a clean cut, he told himself, long but not deep. He had a half-empty bottle of vodka in the inner pocket of the jacket that he kept for exactly the kind of night when staying clean was more important than staying comfortable. He poured it directly into the wound, pressing his forehead against the concrete, while his body decided whether to scream or shut down and chose quietly to do neither. He bandaged it with strips torn from the extra t-shirt in his bag, the one he saved for situations that required a sacrifice of material for something more pressing, and he tied the ends as tight as he could manage with one hand in his teeth. Then he sat back against the concrete piling and listened to the rain and tried to stop shaking. He was still sitting there, almost still, barely breathing the hickory stick across his knees, when he heard the footsteps. Not the shuffling, aimless movement of the people who lived under this bridge. Something else. Coordinated steps in the dark, moving with purpose, with the quiet deliberateness of people who were looking for something specific. Caleb went completely still. A voice said no witnesses. Another voice lower answered, the rat dies tonight. The flashlight beams began moving through the encampment under the bridge, sweeping across the cardboard shelters, in the sleeping shapes, in the shopping carts full of salvaged lives. Moving toward him, Caleb pressed himself against the concrete piling and became, as he had practiced so many hundreds of times, nothing at all. The flashlight beam swept across the concrete piling and missed him by 4 inches. Caleb felt the edge of the light graze the wall beside his face, and he did not breathe, did not blink. His body had gone somewhere beyond shaking, past the point where adrenaline expressed itself as trembling, and into a deeper register, something colder and more fundamental. The stillness of an animal that understood with complete biological certainty that it had been found by something larger than itself. The man holding the flashlight stood close enough that Caleb could smell him. Expensive cologne over cigarette smoke over gun oil, a combination that his street-trained senses cataloged and filed automatically. The beam played across the graffiti on the concrete, illuminating layers of spray paint that went back years. Tags over tags over tags, the accumulated signatures of people trying to prove they had existed in a place that didn't want them. The man's radio crackled. A voice distorted by static said anything. The man keyed the radio. He said negative. Just trash and junkies down here. Keep looking. He's wounded. He can't have gone far. The beam swept one more time across the piling, across the exact spot where Caleb's shoulder was pressed into the concrete, and then moved on. The footsteps resumed moving toward the far end of the encampment, the beam joining 2 other beams in the middle distance. Caleb let the air out of his lungs through his nose, a process that took almost 10 seconds, controlled and silent. He waited another full minute. His lungs burned and his side screamed, and the cold of the concrete had worked its way through his jacket and into his back, and he waited anyway, counting seconds in his head, making himself stay still when every nerve ending he possessed was firing the same message in the same direction. Run. Around him, the other people living under the bridge were moving. Not running, not panicking, but the quiet practiced dispersal of people who had learned that, when trouble arrived with flashlights and coordinated footsteps, the only correct response was to not be where you were. Shopping carts were being moved without their wheels touching the ground. Bodies were sliding deeper into shadows. The unspoken code of the encampment was operating exactly as it always did. When something dangerous comes, you disappear. You don't help your neighbor disappear. You don't stay to watch. Everyone is on their own, and everyone understands this, and no one holds it against anyone else. Because the alternative is having opinions about survival, and opinions about survival are a luxury reserved for people who have options. When the flashlight beams had moved to the far end of the bridge and the voices were distant enough to be indistinct, Caleb moved. He rolled from his position against the piling onto his stomach and crawled, pulling himself forward on his forearms across the cold, wet concrete, pushing with his toes, keeping his profile flat and low. His wounded side pulled and burned with every movement, the bandage already soaking through, and he pressed his teeth together and breathed through his nose and kept moving. He reached the edge of the encampment and found the gap in the chain-link fence he had identified 3 weeks ago and filed away in the mental map he kept of every space he regularly occupied. He had never needed it before. He needed it now. He squeezed through sideways, the fence catching briefly on his jacket before releasing him, and came out on the other side onto the gravel margin of the rail yard. He got to his feet and moved. The rail yard occupied 12 city blocks on the industrial edge of Portland, a decommissioned switchyard that the city had been discussing redeveloping for 11 years without ever quite beginning. It was a graveyard of infrastructure, rows of coupled freight cars sitting on dead tracks, towering stacks of shipping containers in the far section, industrial debris and scrap machinery, and the specific silence of large spaces that had been abandoned by their original purpose, but not yet assigned a new one. It was also among the people who moved through Portland's margins, understood to be the most defensible large space in the city, a maze with 1,000 entry points and no clear sightlines. Somewhere in its metal wilderness, a person who knew how to move quietly could lose themselves completely. Caleb knew how to move quietly. He slipped through the perimeter fence at the northeast corner, bent a section of chain link that someone had already loosened from the post, and stepped into the ordered chaos of the yard. The orange sodium lights on tall poles threw pools of color across the tracks and gravel and made everything outside those pools into absolute darkness. He moved between the lights, staying in the dark corridors, between pools, his sneakers silent on the wet gravel. His side was getting worse. The wound had been manageable in the hours immediately after the alley, when adrenaline was doing the useful work of suppressing pain signals and keeping his systems running at emergency capacity. But adrenaline was a finite resource, and his had been running since 4 in the afternoon, and it was now past 2 in the morning, and the account was overdrawn. What was left was the wound itself, and the wound was communicating directly now, not in the muted background language it had been using, but in the clear, insistent primary voice of infection beginning to establish itself. He could feel the heat radiating from his side, not the sharp heat of fresh injury, but the spreading territorial warmth of something that had decided to stay. He needed antibiotics. He needed stitches. He needed a hospital, which he could not have, which meant he needed the next best thing, which was somewhere warm and hidden, and far enough from the bridge encampment that the men with the flashlights would have to work to find him. He found it 40 minutes later in the dead track section of the yard, a single boxcar sitting uncoupled on a spur line that terminated against a concrete bumper. The sliding door was jammed 3/4 closed. The mechanism rusted solid, but the gap was wide enough for him to turn sideways and push through. Inside it smelled like rust and old grain and the mustiness of space that had been enclosed and untouched for years. The floor was rotted through in the far corner. Boards gone soft and spongy, but the corner nearest the door was solid and relatively dry. Caleb sat down in that corner, pulled his sleeping bag around his shoulders and took stock. The wound was hot and weeping. The bandage he had made from the t-shirt was soaked through and beginning to stiffen at the edges as the blood dried. He had nothing left to clean it with. He had nothing left to rebandage it with. He had his jacket and his sleeping bag and his hickory stick and approximately 400 calories of food in his bag crackers and a protein bar he had been saving. He ate half the protein bar, drank from his water bottle, and lay down on his side with the stick within arm's reach. The fever came for him an hour later. It didn't arrive all at once. It assembled itself gradually, degree by degree, his body temperature climbing in small increments as the infection below his ribs began to do the patient industrial work of bacteria, finding purchase in damaged tissue. He became aware of it first as a change in how the sleeping bag felt against his skin, too rough, too present, every thread individually registering. Then as a change in how the darkness inside the boxcar looked, the shadows seeming to breathe, the walls flexing slightly at the edges of his vision. He told himself it was mild. He told himself he had been through worse. He closed his eyes and the darkness behind them was warmer than the darkness outside them. And he tried to use that warmth rather than fight it, tried to rest inside it rather than lie awake cataloging everything that was wrong. He was still lying there somewhere between sleep and its absence when the voices came back. He's in the yards. The voice came from outside, maybe 30 yards away, carrying through the still night air with the clarity that cold gave to sound. It was smooth and cultured, not the rough working voice of the men from the alley. This was someone who had spent time around boardrooms as well as back alleys, someone who understood both registers and moved between them without effort. The blood trail ended at the tracks. We lost it in the rain, but he didn't go far. Not with that wound. A second voice, thicker with consonants, slightly soft around the edges, find him. The boss is losing patience. The girl got away. The angels are swarming the whole east side. We have a witness loose who can put faces to the operation. The first voice again, Garrett, calm and methodical, spread out. Check every container, every car. He's bleeding. He's weak. He won't last until morning on his own. Caleb's eyes were open. The fever was making the walls of the boxcar breathe again, but his mind was clear in the way that mortal threat created clarity, burning away the fog of infection with something cleaner and colder. He listened to the footsteps spreading out across the gravel in multiple directions, and he mapped their positions the way he mapped everything automatically. The calculations of a person for whom spatial awareness had been a survival skill long before this night. Three of them at minimum, Garrett at the center, two others fanning out. He looked at the floor, at the rotted section in the far corner where the boards had given way to expose the gravel and the rails below. A gap in the floor maybe 18 inches across. He had registered it when he came in and filed it the way he filed everything as a variable in an environment that might become relevant. It had become relevant. Outside closer now, the sound of metal on metal. Someone was checking the coupled cars on the adjacent track, sliding doors back and forth, the sound moving down the line toward him. Got something here. Got one that's been opened recently. The voice was 10 feet away. Caleb moved. He dropped to his stomach and drove himself toward the gap in the floor, pulling with his forearms, the rotted wood crumbling under his weight where he crossed it. The rough edges of the broken boards catching his jacket and then his skin, and he felt the bandage on his wound tear free, and the wound reopen, and the pain was immediate and absolute, and he bit down on the collar of his jacket and kept moving. He squeezed through the gap. He dropped 4 feet onto the gravel between the rails in the dark under the boxcar and landed on his hands and knees and stayed there pressing himself flat as the door of the car above him shrieked open. Empty. A voice directly above him. He was just here. Check the floor. Caleb was already moving. He crawled on his elbows through the gravel under the line of coupled cars, moving away from the open boxcar, putting distance and steel between himself and the voice above. The gravel cut into his palms. His wounded side dragged against the ground with each pull, and the pain was something he acknowledged and then put in a separate room in his head and locked the door on because there was no useful response to it right now. He emerged from under the cars 50 yards down the line in the shadow between two pools of sodium light and got to his feet. He was bleeding freely now, the jacket soaked dark on the left side, and he could feel it moving down his hip with each step. Not pumping, not arterial, but steady and committed. He pressed his right hand against the wound and ran. His legs felt like something was wrong with them, a looseness in the joints, the ground seeming to arrive at his feet slightly later than expected. The fever was doing things to his perception of distance. He focused on one specific thing, the silhouette of the container stacks visible against the slightly lighter sky at the far end of the yard, and he ran toward it. Behind him, a shout, then the crack of a gunshot. The bullet hit a steel rail to his left, and the ricochet sang off into the dark, the sound of it going in every direction at once. Caleb dove behind a stack of wooden pallets, putting the bulk of them between himself and the direction the shot had come from. He pressed his back against the wood and breathed and listened. Spread out, flush him toward the containers. He has nowhere to go from there. Garrett's voice still calm. Directing traffic. Caleb looked around him. The immediate area held the collection of objects that industrial spaces accumulated over years of disuse. Broken glass, iron spikes pulled from old rail ties. A discarded can of spray paint orange, the nozzle clogged, but the can still heavy. An industrial lighter, the long-necked kind used for cutting torches lying in the gravel a few feet away. He looked at these things. He looked at the container stacks rising against the sky 30 yards ahead. He picked up the spray paint can and he thought about what he had available and what he needed and what the geometry of the next 10 minutes was going to require. The fever was making the thinking slow and imprecise, like trying to do mathematics through glass, but the basic shape of it was there. He couldn't fight 3 trained men. He couldn't outrun them much longer, but he was smaller than they were, and he had been surviving in spaces like this for 8 months, and he knew things about enclosed industrial environments that men who lived in houses and drove vans didn't know, because those men had never needed to learn them. He heard Travis before he saw him. The sound was distinctive, the uneven rhythm of a man walking on a badly injured leg, putting too much weight on one side, the crunch of gravel with the specific double beat of someone compensating. Travis had his knee wrapped in something, a strip of cloth visible even at this distance, and he was moving with his flashlight beam held low, sweeping the ground level looking for blood trail. He was moving from Caleb's left, sweeping toward the pallet stack. Caleb waited. He waited until Travis was 20 feet away and had not yet swung the flashlight in his direction. Then he threw the glass bottle he had found at the ground to his right as hard as he could, putting a sharp sidearm rotation on it, the way he had practiced throwing things at stray dogs. The bottle hit a sheet of corrugated metal propped against the base of a container stack and shattered with a sound entirely disproportionate to its size in the stillness of the yard. Travis spun. The flashlight beam went right, following the sound, following the instinct. Caleb came left. He stepped out from behind the pallets and crossed the 10 feet between them at a run, getting behind Travis before the man could process that the sound had been misdirection. He raised the spray paint can and held the nozzle 3 inches from Travis's night vision scope and pressed the button. Orange paint hit the lens and spread and kept spreading as Caleb held the button down for a full 2 seconds, coating the optical surface, completely turning Travis's technical advantage into a smeared orange nothing. Travis screamed. His hands went to his face, clawing at the scope, the flashlight dropping into the gravel. Caleb swung the hickory stick. He had one target, and he took it without hesitation, putting everything he had left into the swing. All the weight of the fear and the fever, and the hours of running, and the specific anger of being hunted through the night like something less than human. The stick connected with Travis's already destroyed knee at full force. The crack was different this time, higher pitched, more final. Travis went down and stayed down, his voice climbing into registers that made the other sounds of the night disappear. Caleb crouched over him and took the radio from his vest and the Glock from his hip holster, and then stepped back into the darkness between the lights and stood very still for 3 seconds, listening to Travis's sounds diminish into something quieter and more rhythmic, and then he moved toward the container stacks. He stopped when he was in the shadow of the first stack. He looked at the Glock in his hands. It was heavy in the way real weapons were heavy, a weight that wasn't just physical, that had implications attached to it. He had held guns before, never fired one. He ran his thumb over the controls with the half-knowledge of someone who had absorbed information about these objects secondhand from conversations and discarded magazines and the careful watching of other people's hands. Full magazine, round-chambered. He held the gun and he thought about what the man had said. The man with the smooth voice and the tactical patience. He had said, "Find the boy. Alive. He's the new leverage." They weren't trying to kill him anymore. They were trying to catch him. They wanted to use him to get back to Mara. They wanted to put him in front of Declan Callahan and make that man choose between his daughter and the stranger who had intervened in an alley, and Caleb understood with complete clarity that the math of that choice was not supposed to favor him. He was supposed to be the variable that got sacrificed to retrieve the constant. If they caught him armed, they would shoot him. If they caught him unarmed, they would take him. If they took him, Mara was back in danger because of him. Caleb looked at the Glock. He ejected the magazine and set it on top of the nearest container. Then he racked the slide and caught the chambered round as it ejected, a move he had watched a veteran do once in a camp on the east side, the man's hands moving with automatic precision, even though his eyes were somewhere else entirely. He placed the loose round beside the magazine. Then he turned the gun over in his hands and found the takedown lever and pressed it, and the gun came apart into its components in the way that all these guns came apart: the frame and the slide and the barrel and the recoil spring and the smaller internal pieces. And he found the firing pin, the small metal rod that made the difference between a weapon and a paperweight, and he threw it as hard as he could into the darkness beyond the lights. He heard it ping off something metal far away in the east section of the yard. He put the frame back together out of habit, and then he put the assembled but non-functional pistol in his waistband, and he picked up his hickory stick, and he began to climb. The container stack nearest to him was 3 units high, each unit 8.5 feet, the total height somewhere around 25 feet. The containers had been stacked with their corner castings interlocking, and the castings created irregular handholds and footholds, a rough ladder up the side of the stack that required strength he wasn't sure he had left. He had it. Barely. He climbed with his right side doing most of the work, his left arm pulling, but not pushing, keeping the strain away from the wound. The metal was cold and wet, and twice his sneakers skidded on the surface, and both times he caught himself and held and kept going. By the time he pulled himself onto the flat roof of the top container, his arms were shaking with exertion, and his side felt like something was trying to exit it through the skin, and his vision had narrowed at the edges from the combination of blood loss and fever. He lay flat on the top of the container and turned his head and looked down. From 25 feet, the geometry of the yard was completely different. He could see the two remaining men moving through the container maze below him, their flashlight beams and the thermal scope on Garrett's rifle creating overlapping cones of visibility that covered the ground level comprehensively. They moved well. They moved like people who had done this before in places that mattered. He watched them and he breathed. The radio he had taken from Travis crackled. "Travis is down. Travis is down." Garrett's voice unhurried copied that. "The boys in the container section. Nowhere left to run." Then Garrett stopped walking and tilted his head and looked up. His thermal scope swept up the side of the container stack. Caleb pressed himself flat before the scope completed its arc, feeling the cold metal of the container roof against his cheek, becoming as thin as he could make himself, as flat and cold and indistinguishable from the surface as 8 months of practice had taught him to be. The scope completed its pass and moved on. Then Garrett's voice came through the radio again, and this time it wasn't directed at Rook. "Come down, kid," he said. "Make it easy on yourself. We just need your legs to work for a few days. You'll heal. Then we let you go. You have my word." Caleb pressed the transmit button. He said, "The firing pin from the Glock is somewhere in the dark over by the east fence. You're welcome to go look for it." 3 seconds of silence. Then Garrett said, and his voice had lost a fraction of its composure, "For the first time you understand who you're dealing with. We are not local. We don't forgive interference. We don't forget faces. You cost my employer a significant operation tonight by sticking your nose into something that wasn't your concern. Now you can make this easy or you can make it hard, but you can't make it go away." Caleb said nothing. Then Garrett said something that changed the temperature of the air on the container roof. He said, "We know about the girl, the one you saved. We know her father's name. We know where the club operates. We had a plan for her before you interfered, and that plan is still viable. The question is whether we execute it with you as our insurance policy or whether we execute it the original way. Your choice, boy. Come down or the girl pays for your stubbornness." Caleb lay on the cold metal roof and looked up at the sky, which was beginning at its eastern edge to shift from absolute black toward the deep purple that preceded false dawn. He thought about Mara in the hospital, about the blood on her forehead, and the way she had fired the taser without hesitating, and the way her voice had broken when she said thank you. He thought about what it meant that these men had come back not just to kill a witness, but to capture him. That they had a plan that had been in motion before tonight, and that losing Mara from it had not ended, it only adapted it. He thought about the firing pins somewhere in the dark in the east section of the yard. He thought about what he had left. One battered stick, a non-functional handgun, a radio, a fever that was making the stars above him blur slightly at their edges, a wound that was filing a very detailed report about its condition with every heartbeat. And the thing he had always had, the thing that 8 months on the street and 6 foster placements and 17 years of being told he was a problem to be managed had never been able to take from him, because it wasn't something you could take from a person. It was something that either was or wasn't there when you needed it, and he had always found it when he needed it. The refusal to stay down. He heard Rook before he saw him. The sound of heavy boots on the metal rungs of the container's corner, casting the rhythmic impact of a large man climbing with purpose and rage. Rook had found the access points on the south face of the stack, and he was coming up them the way he did everything, with direct and uncomplicated violence. Caleb got to his feet. The roof of the container was approximately 40 feet long and 8 feet wide, a narrow elevated platform with nothing on any side of it but a 25-foot drop to concrete and gravel. The sky to the east was definitely purple now, the horizon pulling away from black. Somewhere in the city, people were beginning their mornings making coffee, reading whatever the news had arranged for them overnight. Rook's head appeared at the south edge of the container, then his shoulders, then all of him. He was enormous in this way Caleb had forgotten during the chase. The fact of his physical size having been abstract while he was a voice in the dark and a set of footsteps, but now present and concrete and very close. His bomber jacket was gone, left somewhere in the yard, and without it, he was just shoulders and fury. The nose Caleb had broken, taped across the bridge. Both eyes blackened in the way that broken noses blacken both eyes. The bruising already deep and livid in the growing light. He was holding his combat knife. He was smiling. He said nowhere to run, rat. He said it the same way he had said it in the alley. The same smile. Like he enjoyed the part where the distance closed. Caleb looked at him. He was shaking. His hands on the hickory stick were white-knuckled and trembling, and he was burning from the inside with the fever. And he had maybe 30% of his normal strength available to him. And the man standing 12 feet away had a knife and 250 pounds of functional fury, and nothing wrong with him that mattered. Caleb looked at him and he said, "I'm not running." Because he wasn't. Not anymore. Not from this. Rook charged. The move was direct and committed the way a man charged when he didn't expect serious resistance, crossing the distance between them in 3 long strides. The knife came up from the right side, a slashing arc aimed at the left side of Caleb's body, the same side that was already damaged, targeting the existing wound with the specific malice of someone who knew exactly where to go. Caleb pivoted left instead of right. The counterintuitive move, the wrong move according to every instinct that said, protect the wound, protect the left, but correct, because Rook's arm was fully extended on that arc, and the pivot put Caleb behind the knife rather than in front of it. The blade passed close enough for him to feel the air of it moving past his jacket. He swung the stick. He didn't aim for the head or the arms. He aimed for the ribs, the soft structural component, the place where impact translated most directly into functional damage. The hickory connected with a crack that he felt through the wood all the way up his arms. Rook grunted, slowed for half a step. Then he grabbed the stick. His hand locked around the shaft above Caleb's grip, and he pulled using the mass differential, using the physics of being larger, and Caleb came forward with the pull. His feet barely touching the container roof, and the knife reversed its direction and came back across and opened a new line of fire across Caleb's upper left arm. He cried out. He let go of the stick. Both of them stumbled. Rook with the sudden absence of resistance, Caleb with the wound in his arm and the dizziness that came with it, the blood pressure math of his body running too short on too many things simultaneously. Rook recovered first. He came back around with the stick in one hand and the knife in the other, and he positioned himself and he drew the knife back, and Caleb looked at it and understood that he was out of moves, that the mathematics had finally completed their calculation, and the answer was this narrow metal roof and this specific morning, and this man with the knife drawn back to its full extension. He heard something, not from above him, from below and to the south, coming through the gray air of the early morning like a sound from a different world entirely. A low rumble that grew rapidly, that multiplied, that became a roar. Rook heard it too. His eyes went to the south perimeter of the yard. The chain-link fence at the south entrance of the rail yard came down. Not cut, not climbed over. Down. A wall of it driven inward by the combined momentum of 6 motorcycles running at speed in tight formation. The fence went down, and the motorcycles came through it, and behind them came a black SUV, its headlights blazing, and behind that came 6 more motorcycles. And the sound of it all together was something between a natural disaster and a declaration of war. At the front of the formation, no helmet, his face carved from whatever material existed between granite and fury, was a man on a road king that had been built for someone who took both motorcycles and violence seriously. Rook's knife hand dropped 6 inches. Below, Garrett turned toward the approaching formation and raised his rifle and fired twice. The motorcycles scattered but didn't stop. Return fire came from multiple directions at once, muzzle flashes sparking in the pre-dawn dark from angles that indicated someone had taken the time to spread out before advancing, someone who understood tactical geometry. Garrett took a round in the shoulder. His rifle went down. His hands went up. He was a professional, and professionals knew when a calculation had concluded. Rook on top of the container made a different calculation. He looked at Caleb. He said, "Doesn't matter. Still finish this." The knife came back up. Caleb's legs buckled. Not from fear, from the simple biological truth that his body had been running on reserves for 6 hours, and the reserves were gone, and there was nothing left to draw on the account, close the balance zero. His knees hit the metal roof, and he put one hand down to catch himself and looked up at Rook through the spots that were beginning to cross his vision. He heard boots on the container, on the corner casting, coming up fast from the north side of the stack, a different access point than the one Rook had used, someone who had taken the time to identify an alternate route before beginning the climb. Rook heard them too. He glanced toward the north edge of the container roof, where someone was coming up fast, hand over hand, with the urgency of someone for whom the arithmetic of the next 10 seconds was deeply personal. Earlier that evening, when the motorcycles had first assembled in the parking structure 3 blocks from the rail yard, Mara Callahan had been in the passenger seat of her father's SUV, a bandage fresh on her hairline, and a discharge form in her lap that the St. Jude's night resident had signed under the impression that she was leaving with her father's full knowledge and medical supervision. She had a grade 1 concussion. She had been told rest was required. She had listened to that information with the focused patience of someone filing it in the category of things noted but not binding. When Declan had said stay in the vehicle, she had said yes in the tone of someone who meant it for approximately as long as it took for the SUV to reach a full stop. She had watched from the south fence line as the motorcycles went through it. She had identified the container stack from the muzzle flash of Garrett's rifle. She had found the north face access points, and she had climbed them the way she had climbed things since she was 12 years old, which was with the grim efficiency of someone who understood that height was information and information was leverage. She came over the north edge of the container roof now. She had a gun in her right hand, and she was breathing hard from the climb, and there was fresh blood at her hairline where the hospital stitches had pulled from the exertion, and she did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. She said, "Get away from him." Rook turned the knife toward her. She fired. The shot caught Rook in the left side of his chest, and the impact of it stopped him completely, the way impact stopped things not gradually but all at once. He looked down at himself. He looked at Mara. He looked at the knife in his hand as if he had forgotten how it got there. Then his knees went, and his boots found no purchase on the wet metal roof, and he went backward off the south edge of the container and was gone. The sound he made when he hit the ground 30 feet below was something Caleb would not think about afterward if he could avoid it. Mara crossed the roof in 5 steps and went down on one knee beside him, her free hand finding his shoulder, steadying him. She said, "I told you I fight back." Her voice was shaking. Her hand on his shoulder was not. Caleb looked at her. He was trying to put together a sentence, and the fever was making the words come apart before he could assemble them. He wanted to say something about the hospital, about the concussion and the discharge form, and every reasonable medical argument for why she should not be 25 feet in the air in a rail yard at 5 in the morning. What came out was, "You weren't supposed to be here." She said, "Neither were you." Below them, the sound of the motorcycles was changing, the engines dropping from high urgency to idle men dismounting, voices spreading out across the yard. And then one voice cutting through the others, not raised, not needing to be raised, with the quality of a voice that had never needed volume to carry authority. That voice said, "Mara. Mara called down up here, Dad. Top of the north stack, bring somebody who knows first aid." Her hand was still on Caleb's shoulder, and she didn't remove it. He could feel the trembling in it, that her face wasn't showing the fine motor evidence of everything she was not allowing herself to express in front of him. He said, "You should have stayed in the hospital." She said, "You should have stayed in the alley. We're both bad at staying where we're told." Caleb tried to hold on to that, tried to find something to say in response to it, but the reserves were truly gone now, and the fever had taken the rest, and the edge of his vision was going dark in the way it went dark when the body had decided that consciousness was optional. His hand found the hickory stick on the container roof beside him. His fingers closed around it. Mara caught him before he went down. Heavy footsteps on the corner castings. A man coming up fast with the unhesitating certainty of someone who already knew what he was going to find and had decided what he was going to do about it. Declan Callahan came over the edge of the container and took in the scene in one sweep. His daughter on her knees with fresh blood on her face bracing an unconscious boy. The knife on the roof. The blood pooled and smeared across the metal surface in quantities that made his jaw tighten. He crossed the roof and he crouched beside them and he looked at the boy. He looked at him the way you looked at something that had cost someone something, even if you had nothing to do with the cost. The matted hair and the ruined jacket and the hands that were still even unconscious curved around the hickory stick with the automatic grip of someone who had learned that letting go of the thing protecting you was not something you did even in sleep. He said quietly, "Get a stretcher up here." Then he looked at his daughter. He said, "You were supposed to be in the vehicle." She said he needed someone up here who had something to prove. Declan looked at her for a moment with an expression that was too complicated to be just one thing. Then he said, "You're going to give me gray hair." Mara said, "You already have gray hair." He put his arm around her and she leaned into it, and they both looked at the unconscious boy between them, the boy with the wound in his side and the new wound on his arm, and the fever that was radiating off him like something furnace adjacent, and the stick he would not let go of even now. Below Portland was beginning its morning. The sodium lights were starting to lose the competition with the actual sky, their orange glow dimming as the east went from purple to the gray-pink that preceded the sun. Somewhere across the city, St. Jude's Hospital was changing shifts, and in the trauma wing, a room was being prepared. And on top of a shipping container in an abandoned rail yard at the edge of the city, a man who had spent 20 years building walls around himself sat with his daughter and a boy he didn't know yet, and felt something move in him that he hadn't felt in a very long time and couldn't quite name. The surgery took 4 hours. Caleb was unconscious for most of the ride to St. Jude's, coming up briefly, twice enough to register the leather interior of a large vehicle and the pressure of hands on his wounds, and a voice that told him to stay with it in a tone that didn't leave room for disagreement. He went back under both times before he could determine where he was or form a complete thought about it. The third time he surfaced, there were lights above him, moving past in a row, the way lights moved when you were on a gurney being pushed down a corridor, and someone was cutting his jacket off him with trauma shears, and someone else was calling numbers across his body, and a third person was doing something to the inside of his elbow that he felt distantly through the fog as a small specific pressure. He said, "I didn't steal the money." Nobody responded to that. He went back under. The surgery was for the wound on his side, which had been open and insufficiently cleaned for too many hours and had developed the beginning of a serious infection in the tissue around the original knife cut. The wound on his arm was secondary long but not deep, and was cleaned and closed with 18 stitches while he was already under anesthesia. They gave him 3 units of blood to replace what he had left on the concrete of the rail yard, and the gravel of the bridge encampment, and the floor of the boxcar, and the roof of the shipping container. His temperature on admission was 103.8. He was in recovery for 2 hours after that, and then they moved him to a private room on the 4th floor. He woke up at 2 in the afternoon. The first thing he was aware of was the absence of pain, which was so unusual that it registered as wrong before it registered as good. Pain had been the constant background condition of his existence for so long that its absence felt like a perceptual error, like waking up in a room where gravity worked differently. Then the smell reached him. Bleach and something faintly floral, and underneath both the sterile neutrality of a space that was cleaned multiple times a day by people whose job it was to make sure nothing unwanted took hold. Not the river, not the dumpster, not the sweet rot of the boxcar. He opened his eyes. White ceiling, white walls, the mechanical breathing of monitors, a bag of clear fluid hanging from a pole connected to his arm by a length of tubing that he followed with his eyes to the needle taped to the inside of his elbow. A bed that was not cardboard. A pillow. Sheets that were thin and institutional but horizontal and real. Hospital. The word and everything attached to it hit him in the same instant, and he was sitting up before he had fully processed the decision to do so, the monitors alarming briefly at the change in his position, his eyes going immediately to the door to the window, calculating. Fourth floor, window sealed, door closed, no immediate exit. Hey, easy, you're going to pull your stitches. He turned his head. Mara Callahan was sitting in a plastic chair beside his bed. She had changed out of the clothes from the rail yard, was wearing a soft green sweater and jeans, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. The stitches at her hairline had been redone neat and precise, and the bruise on her cheek had gone through yellow into the deeper purple of the second day. She looked like someone who had slept for 3 hours and decided that was going to have to be enough. She was watching him with the expression of someone who had been watching for a while and had had time to arrange their face into something careful. He said you. His voice was a ruin. Whatever moisture his throat had possessed before the surgery was gone, replaced by the raw scratch of someone who had been intubated and then had the tube removed. She stood and poured water from a plastic pitcher into a cup, held the straw to his lips. He drank without thinking, and it was the coldest and cleanest thing he could ever remember tasting, or maybe that was just the contrast with everything that had preceded it. He pushed the cup away gently. He said, "Where am I?" She said, "St. Jude's. You've been out for almost 14 hours. He looked at the door again. She said, "The warrant is gone. My dad had it withdrawn this morning. You're not in trouble, Caleb." He looked at her. He said, "How do you know my name?" She said, "My dad found it. He has people who are good at finding things." He absorbed that, turned it over, looking for the angle of it, the way you looked for the angle of everything, when information arrived from people who had power and you didn't, when kindness came attached to things you couldn't see yet. He said, "What does he want?" She said, "To talk to you, when you're ready." He said, "People who want to talk to you don't usually frame it that way." The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. She said, "He's not most people." Caleb looked at the window. The light coming through it was the flat gray of a Portland afternoon, the same quality of light it had been for 3 days, rain diffused and directionless. Somewhere out there, the textile district was going about its business. The loading dock doorway on 4th Avenue was sitting empty. He thought about the hickory stick. His hand moved before he could stop it, reaching to the side of the bed, finding nothing. She said, "It's here." She reached below the chair and lifted the stick and laid it across the bed beside him. It was the same stick, the splintered end and the electrical tape grip, the same weight he had felt in his hand so many times that it had become less a separate object than an extension of himself. He put his hand on it and felt the familiar roughness of the tape, and something in his chest settled. He said, "Thank you." She said, "You said that to me too in the alley, except I was the one who was supposed to say it." He looked at her. He said, "You weren't supposed to be on top of that container." She said, "You keep saying that." He said, "Because it's true." She said, "You weren't supposed to walk into a kidnapping with a stick and no backup." We're both doing things we weren't supposed to do. I think that's just who we are. Before he could respond to that, the door opened. The air in the room changed. It was the only way Caleb could have described it later. A change in atmospheric pressure, a shift in the weight of the space, the way a room changed when it was entered by something that carried its own gravity. Declan Callahan walked in. In the rail yard in the pre-dawn dark, Caleb had registered him as a silhouette and a voice and a presence. In the flat light of the hospital room, he was all of those things, but more specific. A large man, not tall in the obvious way, but solid in the way of something built rather than grown, with the kind of physical reality that communicated itself before any other information did. His leather cut was worn to the texture of something organic, decorated with patches that his eyes didn't have the context to read, but that his instincts read as a language of rank and history. His face was all planes and angles, the features of someone for whom expression was a considered act rather than a reflex. Gray at the temples and in the beard and in the lines at the corners of his eyes. He stopped at the foot of the bed. He looked at Caleb for a moment without speaking the way he had looked at him on top of the container, that look that had too many things in it to resolve into any single identifiable expression. Then he said, "You look better than you did yesterday." His voice was lower than Caleb had expected from a man his size, quieter. The kind of voice that had learned it didn't need to be loud. Caleb said, "I'm sorry. I didn't know she was yours. I didn't mean to cause trouble." Declan pulled a chair around and sat down on it backward, his arms across the top rail, looking at Caleb with an expression that was now more legible. It was the expression of someone who had just heard something mildly absurd. He said, "You didn't cause the trouble. You walked into the middle of someone else's trouble with a stick and no backup and almost died doing it. Those are different things." He leaned forward slightly. He said, "I want to talk business with you." Caleb's hands tightened on the sheet. He said, "I don't have anything." Declan said, "I'm not asking for anything. I'm offering something." He reached into his jacket and placed two things on the bedside table: a key silver for a standard deadbolt, and a folded piece of paper which he opened and smoothed flat. It was a document, official looking, with a court seal at the top. He said, "The warrant for your arrest has been vacated. Judge Morrison signed off on it this morning. Your record is clean." Caleb looked at the document without touching it. Declan said, "But you're 17, which means you're a minor, which means the state has a position on where you sleep, and if we don't address that position formally, someone in a gray cubicle somewhere is going to address it for us in a way that doesn't account for your preferences." He tapped the key on the table. He said, "I run a legitimate business. Saints Auto and Custom on the industrial corridor 3 miles from here. Classic car restoration and custom motorcycle builds. Real work, skilled work, the kind of work that takes years to learn properly. I need an apprentice." He paused. He said, "There's an apartment above the garage. 2 rooms, bathroom, working heat. It's yours rent-free for as long as you want it. In exchange, you work 40 hours a week at the shop, you complete your GED, and Mara helps you get there. She has the patience for it. I can offer you those things. What I can offer you is a guarantee about how any of it turns out, because nobody can offer you that, and anyone who says they can is lying to you." Caleb looked at the key. He had thought about keys before, had thought about them in the way that people thought about things they had been, without long enough that the idea of them became almost theoretical. A key meant a door. A door meant a space that closed. A space that closed meant something on the inside of it that was separate from whatever was on the outside. He said, "Warren Pruitt has custody paperwork." Declan said, "Warren Pruitt has nothing." He said it with the flat certainty of someone describing a condition that had already been established, rather than a claim that was open to dispute. He said, "I looked into Pruitt, your last placement. His record goes back further than he'd like anyone to know." Caleb went still. Declan said, "I know what that house was. Not the details, because I don't need the details, and you don't need to tell them to me. I know the shape of it. I know what a man looked like when he had been running that kind of operation through the system for years and knew exactly how to keep the complaints from going anywhere. I know because I have had cause to learn what those men look like." He stopped for a moment. He said, "You didn't steal $200 from a coffee can." Caleb didn't say anything. Declan said, "You climbed out of a window in the middle of the night because it was the better option. That tells me everything I need to know about what the worse option was." The monitors beeped steadily. Outside the window, the rain had resumed the soft percussion of it against glass. Caleb said, "You don't know me." Declan said, "I know what I saw on that security camera. I know what my daughter told me, which is that there was a clear path out of that alley and you didn't take it. I know what I saw on top of that container, which is a kid who had been running all night with a knife wound and a fever, who had already done the one thing that kept him alive, which was disarm himself, and who was still standing up when Rook came at him." He leaned forward. He said, "I've known men who'd take a bullet for their brother. I've known men who'd ride into a bad situation without thinking twice because that's who they are. But I've never met a 17-year-old with nothing, with less than nothing, who did what you did in that alley for someone he'd never spoken to. That's not something you learn. That's something you either have or you don't." He extended his hand across the end of the bed. He said, Do we have a deal? Caleb looked at the hand. He looked at Mara, who was watching him with an expression that was trying not to push him anywhere, that was giving him the space to arrive at whatever he was going to arrive at on his own schedule. He thought about the doorway on 4th Avenue and the warm air from the bakery vent and the discipline of making yourself small enough and still enough that the world moved around you without registering you as something real. He thought about the night under the I-5 bridge and the men with the flashlights and the way his heart had sounded in his own ears when the beam had passed 4 inches from his face. He thought about what Declan had said, about the window, about the worse option. He reached out and put his hand in Declan's. The grip was brief and solid and said the things that a man like Declan Callahan apparently communicated through the quality of a handshake rather than through elaboration. Declan reached behind his chair and produced something wrapped in cloth, set it on the bed beside Caleb's existing stick. He said, "Unwrap it." Caleb pulled back the cloth. It was a staff. Hickory like his old one, but finished rather than raw sanded to smoothness and treated with something that brought out the depth of the grain. The top was capped in silver, engraved with a running wolf that spiraled around the circumference of the cap. The base was fitted with a steel tip, the kind that could take impact without splitting. The balance was perfect. He could feel the balance just from lifting it from the cloth. The weight distributed along its length, the way a well-made thing distributed its weight so that it felt like an extension of the person holding it rather than a separate object. Declan said a knight needs a sword. He said it simply without ceremony, the way you said things that were true and didn't require decoration. Caleb turned the staff in his hands and looked at the wolf on the silver cap and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that would have been adequate to the moment. And he had learned a long time ago that silence was sometimes the more honest response. The door opened. A hospital security guard stepped in, a woman in her 40s, with the expression of someone delivering information she had been told to deliver and would prefer not to be involved in. She looked at Declan and then quickly away from him, a recalibration. She said, "Mr. Callahan, there's a man in the lobby, says his name is Warren Pruitt, says he's here to collect his ward." The room went quiet in a way that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that occupied the space where sound had been. Caleb felt it happen in his own body before he processed it consciously. The monitors beside his bed climbing their readout as his heart rate spiked from the resting rate it had achieved back into the range of something more urgent. His right hand found the silver-capped staff. His fingers wrapped around it the way they had wrapped around the hickory stick in the alley, the way they had wrapped around it on top of the container, the automatic grip of someone for whom holding the thing that could protect him was not a choice, but a reflex built from years of necessity. He said, and his voice came out quieter than he intended, "He has paperwork. He has the legal right." Declan stood up from the chair. He was not moving quickly. He was moving the way he had moved through the rail yard, with the unhurried certainty of someone for whom speed was unnecessary because nothing in his path was going to remain there. He looked at Caleb. He said, "Stay here." 2 words, quiet and absolute. He looked at the security guard and said, "Tell him I'll be right down." Then he looked at Mara and said, "Door locked. Nobody in except clinical staff you personally recognize." He picked up the manila folder he had brought with him and walked out. Mara crossed to the door and turned the lock. She came back and sat on the edge of the bed, close enough that her presence was a specific warmth. She did not touch him. She seemed to understand that touch right now was not what he needed, that what he needed was proximity and stillness and the reassurance of someone being with you without requiring anything from you in return. She said, "My dad keeps his word." She said it the way you said something that was true and that you needed someone else to understand was true, not as reassurance exactly, but as information that you were offering because you were certain of it. Caleb said Pruitt has been working the system for years. He knows which forms to file. He knows how to talk to judges. Mara said so does my dad. Caleb tightened his grip on the staff. He said, "What if it doesn't work?" She said, "Then we figure out something else. But it's going to work." He looked at the locked door. He said, "What is he going to do down there?" She said exactly what needs to be done, not more. The lobby of St. Jude's Hospital was at 3:15 on a Thursday afternoon, moderately occupied. Patients and visitors moved through it in the unhurried way of people navigating a space defined by waiting. The reception desk was staffed by two women who had learned to evaluate the nature of any incoming situation within about 4 seconds of its arrival and respond accordingly. Warren Pruitt was standing near the reception desk when Declan Callahan came through the elevator doors and crossed the lobby toward him. Pruitt looked exactly as he always looked in these situations. He had cultivated the look over years, refined it through dozens of interactions with social workers and school administrators and court-appointed officers, perfected it in the way that certain skills were perfected through repetition. He was wearing khaki pants and a blue polo shirt and a fleece vest, the clothes of a man who coached Little League and attended neighborhood association meetings, the clothes of the specific kind of respectable that was designed to read as safe. He had a folder in his hands and the expression of a man who was a little bit worried and a lot committed to doing the right thing. He looked at Declan approaching and kept the expression in place, which was an achievement of its own. Declan stopped 8 feet away. He said, "Warren Pruitt." Pruitt said, "I'm here for my foster son. I understand he was brought in last night. The name in his file is Caleb O'Connell, though I understand he may have given a different name here. I have the current guardianship documentation right here." He held up the folder. Declan said, "Interesting." Pruitt said, "I don't know who you are, but this is a family matter, and I'd ask you to let the hospital staff do their jobs." Declan said, "My name is Declan Callahan. The boy upstairs is under my protection, which means this is not a family matter, so much as it is a conversation you and I are going to have in the next few minutes that will determine how the rest of your week goes." Pruitt adjusted his expression slightly, adding a layer of concerned confusion over the careful base of reasonableness. He said, "I don't want any trouble. I'm just here for the boy. He ran away 8 months ago, and I've been worried sick." Declan said, "I'm sure you have been." He said it without inflection. He reached into his leather cut and produced his own folder and placed it on the reception counter between them. He did not open it immediately. He set it down the way you set something down when you wanted the other person to look at it and understand what it represented before they saw what was inside it. He said, "I had someone look into your history. Your full history, not the version that's in the official files, but the version that exists in the spaces between the official reports, in the complaints that were filed, and then went quiet in the case notes that were summarized in ways that obscured their content in the financial records that showed government stipend payments for children who were no longer living in your home." Pruitt's expression was doing a complicated thing. Declan opened the folder. He said, "Jessica Hartwell, 14 years old, filed a complaint 18 months ago, said she was confined to the basement for 2 days without food as punishment for breaking a household rule. Case dismissed. No corroborating evidence." He turned a page. Tyler Oaks, 16, filed a complaint 2 years ago, said food was systematically withheld as a control mechanism. Case dismissed. Investigator noted insufficient evidence. He turned another page. Sarah Whitmore, 15. Her complaint was more detailed. "We don't need to go through it here." He looked up. He said, "None of these cases went anywhere. You've been good at that, understanding exactly where the line is, exactly how much can happen before it becomes something the system can't ignore, a very specific and practiced skill." He turned to the last page in the folder. He said, "What's more interesting is the financial picture. You are currently listed as the legal guardian of 3 minors and receiving the corresponding monthly stipends from the state, except only one of those children is living in your home. The other 2 ran away, one 4 months ago and one 7 months ago, and you never reported either disappearance, because reporting them would have meant giving up the checks." Pruitt said, "That's not." Declan said, "That's federal fraud. The money is federal, which makes the fraud federal, which means the FBI rather than the Portland PD, which means a different set of resources and a different level of interest in making sure the case is handled correctly." He said it quietly. The reception desk staff had found reasons to be elsewhere. He said, "I've already put together a complete package. It's sitting right now with someone I trust. Whether that package gets delivered to the FBI field office on Southwest 3rd Avenue tomorrow morning is entirely determined by what you choose to do in the next 60 seconds. He looked at Pruitt steadily. He said, walk out of this hospital, leave Portland by tomorrow morning, and the package stays where it is. Come back, file another form, make another call, send another letter, and the package gets delivered, and you spend the next several years discovering what federal prison was like for people who had done what you had done to children. He said 60 seconds. Pruitt looked at the folder, looked at Declan, looked at the lobby of the hospital with its afternoon traffic moving around them as if they were a rock in a stream, the way people in shared spaces unconsciously routed around anything that felt like it had a field of force around it. Pruitt made a calculation. He had been making calculations his entire adult life, the small constant arithmetic of a person who had built everything he had by understanding risk and managing it by reading rooms and adjusting accordingly. He was good at it. He had survived a long time by being good at it. He closed his folder. He said, this isn't finished. He said it without conviction, the way you said something, because not saying anything felt like a larger concession than saying something you didn't believe. Declan said, yes, it is. Pruitt walked toward the automatic doors. Declan watched him go. He watched the doors open and close behind him, and he stood there for a moment with his folder in his hand in the lobby of St. Jude's Hospital, and then he took out his phone and made a call. He said, the package we discussed. Deliver it. He said, tomorrow morning. First thing. He ended the call and put the phone back in his jacket. He took the elevator back to the 4th floor. When the elevator doors opened, he walked down the corridor toward the room at the end of it, where his daughter and the boy were waiting. He was 10 feet from the door when it opened from the inside, and what he saw stopped him. Caleb was in the corridor. He was wearing the hospital gown and the grip socks they put on surgical patients, an IV line still attached to his arm trailing the portable stand behind him on its wheels. He was holding the silver-capped staff in his right hand, using it not as a weapon but as a support. His weight partially on it, his posture, the posture of someone who had recently had surgery and was aware of it, but was standing up anyway because standing up was what the moment required. He was looking down the corridor toward the elevator bank, toward the place where Warren Pruitt was going to pass on his way out. Mara was in the doorway behind him watching. She had not tried to stop him. She had understood apparently what this was and what it required, and that her job right now was to be present at the edge of it without stepping into the center of it, because the center of it belonged to him. The elevator chimed. The doors opened. Pruitt stepped out with his folder under his arm, and his careful expression already being reassembled, turning to face the corridor, and found Caleb Morrow standing 8 feet in front of him in a hospital gown with a silver-capped staff and 18 stitches in his arm, and a fever that hadn't fully broken yet, and eyes that were steady and clear and not afraid. Pruitt stopped. The two of them stood in the corridor of the 4th floor of St. Jude's Hospital and looked at each other. Caleb said, you told me I was worthless. His voice was still rough from the surgery, but it was steady in a way that had nothing to do with physical condition and everything to do with something that had been building since the night he climbed out of a second-story window into a juniper hedge and chose the uncertainty of the street over the certainty of that house. He said, you told me I was a waste. You told me the system had been trying to fix me for years, and that what it had found was that there was nothing to fix because there was nothing there. You said that to me the night before I climbed out of the window. Pruitt said nothing. Caleb said, I just want you to know that you were wrong. He said it simply, not with anger, not with the performance of triumph, not with any of the things that would have made it smaller than it was. He said it the way you said something that was true and that you had needed to say out loud so that it existed in the world as a spoken thing, rather than just something you carried alone in the dark. He said, I know what you are. I know what you did. I know what you're going to keep doing if someone doesn't stop you. And someone is. He held the man's gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he stepped aside. Not back, sideways. Giving Pruitt the corridor, but on Caleb's terms, in Caleb's time, with Caleb's hands still steady on the staff, and Caleb's eyes still on him until the elevator doors closed between them and the man was gone. Caleb stood in the corridor and listened to the hum of the elevator descending. Declan had stopped walking when he saw what was happening. He had stayed still and watched and had not intervened and had not spoken because he understood what he was watching, and he understood that it did not require him. Some things needed a witness more than they needed a participant, and he was old enough to know the difference. Now he walked forward. He stopped beside Caleb and looked at the closed elevator doors. He said after a moment, "How are the stitches?" Caleb said, "Still there." Declan said, "Good. Let's get you back to bed before the nursing staff has opinions about the IV stand in the corridor." He put his hand briefly on Caleb's shoulder just for a second, the way you touch someone's shoulder when words were in the right direction, but not quite sufficient for everything that needed to be said. Then he walked him back to the room. 6 months later, the rain came back to Portland as it always did, as it had always done, settling over the city in early autumn, with the patient permanence of something that knew it was welcome, whether it was wanted or not. Inside Saint's Auto and Custom on the industrial corridor, the rain drummed on the tin roof in a rhythm that Caleb had come to associate with comfort rather than cold. The building had been an auto repair shop in a previous life, and it still smelled like what it had always been: motor oil and metal and the ozone of electrical work. But layered over that now was the smell of lacquer and machine polish, and the deep mineral scent of good wood being worked carefully. Caleb stood at the main bench with a torque wrench in his right hand and a technical manual open beside him on the bench surface. He was working on the engine of a 1967 Chevelle that had come to the shop in pieces, literally in boxes, the previous owner having disassembled it in a fit of ambition 20 years ago and never reassembled it. The project had been Declan's first formal assignment to him, delivered the day he came back from the hospital, and it had taken him 4 months to understand it well enough to begin putting it back together in the right order. He was wearing a gray mechanic's jumpsuit, the good kind heavy canvas with reinforced knees. His name was embroidered over the breast pocket in red thread. Caleb. Just the one name because that was all he had given them in the beginning, and they had not pushed for more. And then eventually he had offered the rest of it himself, and they had added it to the shop records and left the embroidery as it was, because by then it had become simply how people referred to him. The hickory staff leaned against the wall in the corner of his workstation. Not the old one, the new one, the one with the silver wolf cap and the steel tip. He didn't need it to walk. The wounds had healed with the thoroughness that 17-year-old bodies brought to healing, leaving scars that were visible and that he had stopped trying to keep covered under long sleeves. He carried the staff because it had become something more than a weapon and more than a tool and more than a symbol, something that occupied a category that didn't have a clean name, but that he understood from the inside without needing to define it. The bikers called him the Shepherd. He had found out third hand from Mara, who had heard it from Cutter, who had let it slip without meaning to. Nobody used the name to his face except occasionally Declan, who used it the way he used everything, straightforwardly and without explanation. It had started apparently as a reference to the way he had protected Mara with the staff that night in the alley, and it had spread through the club the way these things spread, through the transmission system of men who rarely discussed what they felt, but found ways to name it anyway. He had been called worse things. He had been called worse things in rooms that smelled like the basement on the east side of Portland, in the dark behind a locked door. The Shepherd was fine. Forge put his head around the corner of Bay 3 and said that timing chain on the Harley. "You touch it this morning," Caleb said. "Adjusted it before 8. She should be running clean." Forge disappeared back around the corner. A moment later, the Harley's engine turned over, idled, settled into the smooth murmur of a machine that had been correctly calibrated. Forge said something to Cutter that Caleb couldn't hear, and Cutter laughed, and the sound of it moved through the shop the way good sounds move through spaces that knew how to hold them. The bay door rolled up at the far end of the shop, letting in the gray afternoon light and the smell of rain on warm asphalt, and Mara came in carrying 2 cups of coffee and a paper bag from the place on the corner that Declan called adequate, and Caleb had decided was the best coffee in Portland, though he acknowledged that his frame of reference for coffee included a significant period of drinking whatever had been left in the urn at the soup kitchen on Burnside. She set one of the cups on his bench beside the manual and settled onto the stool she had claimed as hers in the first week, and that no one had disputed since. She said essay section tonight, 7 o'clock. He said, I know. She said you said that last Thursday, and then you spent 40 minutes explaining why the timing on the Chevelle's camshaft was more immediately pressing than the persuasive essay format. He said the camshaft was more immediately pressing. She said the GED exam is in 3 weeks, Caleb. He said, I know, 7 o'clock. She looked at the Chevelle and then at the manual, and then at the way his hands were positioned on the torque wrench, the unhurried confidence of someone who had learned something properly rather than quickly. She said Wren pulled the final confirmation from the FBI yesterday. Pruitt's trial date is set for February. Caleb turned the wrench through 2 more degrees of rotation. Set it down. He said good. She said there are 3 other kids involved in the case. 2 of them have already been placed in new homes. The third one, a girl 14, she's still in temporary placement. Caleb said what happens to her. Mara said that's still being worked out. He nodded. He picked the wrench back up and turned back to the engine. He said, tell your dad I said something needs to happen for that kid. Mara said, tell him yourself. He's bringing barbecue at noon. As if on cue, the sound of a motorcycle in the lot outside the specific engine note of a Road King that Caleb had learned to identify the way you learn to identify the voices of people you spent real time around. A door, boots on concrete, the particular rhythm of a man who walked like he owned every floor he crossed, but had never needed to prove it. Declan came in carrying a paper bag that smelled like something that had been slow cooked since early morning. He set it on the workbench at the center of the shop, the one that served as a table when the tools were cleared from it, and he looked around at what was happening in each bay with the evaluating sweep of someone who was always simultaneously the mechanic who cared how the work was going and the man responsible for the people doing it. He said Chevelle. Caleb said getting there. Declan walked over and looked at the engine block, and then at the manual, and then at the torque spec Caleb had been working to. He said good. You're within spec on all of it. He said it without making it a bigger thing than it was, which was the way he said everything that was actually significant. The significance was in the fact that he had checked that he had come over and looked that the looking was itself the statement. He cleared the tools from the center bench and opened the bag, and Mara came over and the 3 of them ate on overturned milk crates in the corner of the shop, the way they had eaten most Saturdays for the past 5 months, in the comfortable silence of people who had stopped needing to fill the space between them with noise, because the space itself had become something they trusted. The rain kept its rhythm on the tin roof. Declan said DMV confirmed the driving test. 3rd week of next month. Caleb said, I know. Declan said you pass it, we start looking at bikes. Caleb said, you don't have to do that. Declan said, I know I don't have to. He said it the same way he said the things that mattered, like the matter of the thing spoke for itself and didn't need him to elaborate on it. Mara said he's been practicing on the Yamaha in the back lot since August. Declan looked at Caleb. Caleb said it seemed practical to prepare. Declan's expression shifted in the way it occasionally shifted the planes of it, rearranging themselves into something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one that existed in the territory that men like Declan Callahan inhabited instead of smiling openly. He said practical. He said it once quietly like he was tasting the word and finding it accurate. After lunch, after Mara had gone back to her apartment across the city with the essay prompt she had written out on a card and left on his bench after Declan had walked the shop one more time with the satisfied quiet of a man whose world was in order after the other mechanics had logged out, and the bay doors had rolled down, and the shop had settled into the silence of a large space. After the work stopped for the day, Caleb climbed the stairs to the apartment above the garage. It was small, 2 rooms and a bathroom and a kitchen that occupied one wall of the main room. The furniture was spare and functional, a bed and a table and 2 chairs and a bookshelf that he had been filling gradually, mostly with repair manuals and technical references, but also in the last 2 months with other things, the kind of things that Mara had started leaving on the counter during tutoring sessions with the studied casualness of someone trying to make a gift look accidental. The window above the kitchen sink looked out over the industrial corridor, over the wet rooftops, and the orange pools of streetlights, and the distant suggestion of the bridges across the Willamette. The same bridges he had slept under. The same city from a completely different position within it. He stood at the window for a while and let himself feel what it was standing. At a window that was his window, in a room that was his room, in a building where people knew his name and used it the way names were supposed to be used, as something that belonged to him, rather than something attached to a file in a gray cubicle somewhere. He took his phone from his pocket, a basic model that Declan had given him in the second week for work and for safety, both of those words meaning things they hadn't meant before. He opened the Notes app. He had been writing in it on and off for the past 4 months. Not a journal exactly, more like the things that surfaced during the long evenings after the shop closed, when the apartment was quiet and the rain was on the roof, and his brain was doing what brains did when they finally had enough safety to start processing what had happened in the time before the safety. He wrote for a while. He wrote, "I used to think that being seen was the danger. I spent 8 months making myself into negative space, into the gap between real things. A heap of fabric and shadow, architecture, absence. I got very good at it, and the problem with getting very good at it was that it worked, and the problem with it working was that it worked in both directions. The world couldn't hurt me because it couldn't see me, but it also couldn't reach me, couldn't hold me, couldn't call me by my name and mean it." He wrote, "What I know now is that the gap doesn't protect you. It just means you disappear before anyone has the chance to hurt you or find you or recognize in you something worth recognizing." He wrote, "The night I stepped out of that doorway, I thought I was going to die. I was probably right, but I wasn't invisible anymore, and that turned out to matter more than I had expected it to. Because Mara saw me. Because Declan saw the footage and recognized something in the way I moved that he said you either had or you didn't. Because I stopped erasing myself long enough for the world to find out I was there." He wrote, "I have a room. I have work that I'm learning to do properly with my hands, with the patience that comes from caring about the outcome. I have people who use my name the way it belongs to me. I have a staff with a wolf on the silver cap that I carry. Not because I'm afraid, but because it's mine, because I chose it. Because who I am now includes the person who held on to a stick when everything else was gone and didn't let go." He wrote, "My name is Caleb Morrow. I live in Portland, Oregon. I am a mechanic and a student and a member of something I don't have a clean word for yet, something that functions like family and operates like loyalty and feels from the inside of it, like the thing I spent 17 years not knowing I was looking for." He wrote, "I'm home." He saved the note and set the phone on the windowsill and looked out at the rain-lit city for a while longer, at the orange pools on the wet pavement and the distant bridge lights blurred to softness by the water on the glass. He thought about all the other kids, in all the other doorways in the camps, and under the bridges, and in the houses that locked their basements, the ones who were still practicing invisibility because invisibility was what they had. He thought about the 14-year-old girl that Mara had mentioned, the one still in temporary placement, the one for whom something needed to happen. He couldn't fix everything. He couldn't reshape a system that turned children into files and called the result care. He was 17 years old, and he had recently learned to set the timing on a 1967 Chevelle, and he was 3 weeks from a GED exam that he was, if he was honest with himself, going to pass. But he was here. He was visible. He was proof that the calculation could come out differently, that a kid with nothing did not have to remain a kid with nothing, that there were variables the calculation didn't account for. The specific density of hickory wood, the quality of a person's attention in a dark alley, the willingness to step out of the shadow and let the world see you, even when everything you had learned said that being seen was the thing that got you hurt. He could be that. He could be proof that it was possible to stop erasing yourself and survive the experience. He could be the thing that someone found when they needed to know that the gap was not permanent, that the absence was not the whole story, that you could step out of the negative space and into something that held you. He reached out and touched the silver wolf cap of the staff where it leaned against the wall beside the window. He felt the lines of the engraving under his fingertip, the careful work of someone who had taken time with it, because the person it was for was worth taking time with. He could be proof. He stood at the window until the lights of the city blurred at the edges, and then he let them blur, and he did not look away.